the dust never settled in Redemption Valley. It swirled around broken dreams and buried secrets, coating everything in a fine layer of regret. But, on that scorching July night in 1987, when the cicadas screamed their summer song and the air hung thick with promise and danger, two souls collided in a way that would reshape not just their own destinies, but the fate of an entire community. She was the preacher's daughter who had never known desire until it struck her like lightning. He was the drifter with calloused hands and a heart full of scars, running from a past that chased him across 3 states. Neither of them knew that the words whispered in passion that night would echo through generations, or that their forbidden love would become the catalyst for a chain of events involving murder, betrayal, family secrets, and a town's reckoning with its own dark history. This is the story of how a single night of passion can alter the course of multiple lives, how love can both damn and redeem, and how sometimes the very thing that destroys us is also the only thing that can save us. In Redemption Valley, where the wind carries both prayers and curses, nothing is ever as simple as right or wrong, and the price of love is often paid by those who never chose to love at all. The black stallion appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering through the heat waves that danced across the empty highway. Sarah Mae Henderson pressed her face against the window of Henderson's General Store, watching as the rider approached Redemption Valley with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and all the time in the world to get there. The stranger dismounted outside Mama Rosie's diner, his boots hitting the gravel with a soft thud that somehow carried across the stillness of the afternoon. Sarah Mae had lived in Redemption Valley all 24 years of her life, and she could count on one hand the number of times a genuine stranger had ridden into town on horseback. Most folks drove pickup trucks or beat-up sedans. Horses were for ranchers and Sunday church parades. But this man was different. Even from a distance, she could see the way he moved with fluid grace, like he and the horse were extensions of each other. His hat sat low over his eyes, casting shadows across a face she couldn't quite make out, but there was something about his silhouette that made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with the lunch she'd skipped. "Sarah Mae, stop gawking and help me with these inventory sheets." Her father's voice cut through her reverie like a rusty blade. Pastor William Henderson ran the general store with the same iron fist he used to run his congregation, and he had no patience for what he called foolishness and vanity. "Yes, Daddy." Sarah Mae reluctantly turned away from the window, but her mind remained fixed on the stranger. She wondered where he'd come from, what had brought him to their sleepy town, and, most importantly, why her heart was beating like a trapped bird against her ribs. The bell above the store's entrance chimed 30 minutes later, and Sarah Mae looked up from the ledger she'd been pretending to focus on. The stranger filled the doorway, and, for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that strained against his worn denim shirt. His jeans were faded from sun and work, and his boots had seen more miles than most people's cars. But it was his eyes that struck her, silent, dark brown, almost black, with depths that suggested he'd seen things most folks couldn't imagine. "Afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture so old-fashioned it seemed to come from another century. His voice was deep and quiet, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. Southern, maybe, or Southwestern. "I'm looking for work. Wondering if you might know of anyone in the area who could use an extra hand." Pastor Henderson looked up from his papers, his pale blue eyes immediately suspicious. "What kind of work?" "Ranch work, mostly. I'm good with horses, cattle, mending fences. Been working ranches since I was 12. The stranger's gaze drifted to Sarah Mae for just a moment before returning to her father. In that brief glance, she felt something pass between them: recognition, curiosity, danger. All three at once. "Name's Jake Morrison," he continued. "I can provide references, though they're from down Texas way." "Texas is a long way from here," Pastor Henderson observed, setting down his pen with deliberate precision. "What brings you to Wyoming?" Jake shrugged, a gesture that managed to be both casual and guarded. "Sometimes a man needs a fresh start." Sarah Mae felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she couldn't say why. There was something about the way Jake Morrison stood there, calm and patient under her father's scrutiny, that made her want to defend him. Which was ridiculous, since she didn't even know him. "The Rockingham Ranch might could use help," she found herself saying. Mrs. Martinez was in here yesterday complaining about being short-handed since her son moved to Denver. Both men turned to look at her, and Sarah May immediately wished she'd kept her mouth shut. Her father's expression had shifted from suspicious to something harder, something that promised a conversation later about speaking out of turn. But Jake Morrison's face showed something that might have been gratitude, mixed with an interest that made her pulse quicken. "Much obliged for the information, miss," he said. "The Rockingham, you said?" "About 5 miles north of here," Sarah May continued, ignoring the warning look from her father. "Take the main road until you see the red mailbox, then turn right. Can't miss it." Sarah May, Pastor Henderson's voice carried a clear warning. "I'll head out there directly," Jake said. He touched his hat brim again, this time looking directly at Sarah May. "Thank you kindly, Miss Henderson. Sarah May Henderson." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Miss Henderson." The way he said her name made it sound like something precious, something worth remembering. "I'm grateful for your help." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Pastor Henderson, is it? Your daughter's got a kind heart. You must be proud." Before Pastor Henderson could respond, Jake Morrison was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of leather and something indefinably masculine that made Sarah May's head spin. "That man's trouble," Pastor Henderson said, his voice flat and certain. "I can smell it on him like cheap whiskey." Sarah May wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Jake Morrison had been nothing but polite and respectful. Instead, she nodded and returned to the inventory sheets, though the numbers swam before her eyes like tadpoles in a pond. 3 days passed before she saw him again. 3 days during which she found herself looking out the store window every time she heard hoofbeats or the rumble of an engine. 3 days during which she replayed their brief conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, every inflection. On Thursday afternoon, she was walking home from the store when she heard her name called from behind. She turned to find Jake Morrison leading his black stallion down the main street, his face wearing the same serious expression she remembered. "Miss Henderson," he said, falling into step beside her. The horse followed docilely, as well trained as she'd suspected. "I wanted to thank you again. Mrs. Martinez hired me on. Seems her regular hands are dealing with family troubles. I'm glad it worked out." Sarah May was proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the way her heart had started that wild beating again. "Are you finding Redemption Valley to your liking?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "It's peaceful," he said finally. "I haven't known much peace in recent years." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the white picket fence that surrounded the Henderson property. The house sat back from the road, a modest 2-story structure with blue shutters and a wraparound porch where Pastor Henderson could often be found in the evenings, reading his Bible and watching the neighbors with disapproving eyes. "This is where I live," Sarah May said unnecessarily. "It's a fine house," Jake observed. "Looks like a good place to grow up." Something in his tone suggested his own childhood hadn't been spent in such comfortable surroundings. Sarah May found herself wanting to ask about his past, his family, his life before Redemption Valley. But she'd been raised not to pry, and there was something about Jake Morrison that suggested certain subjects were best left alone. "I should go in," she said reluctantly. "Daddy will be expecting me to help with dinner preparations." "Of course." Jake tipped his hat. "Maybe I'll see you around town." "Maybe," Sarah May agreed, though something in her voice suggested it was more than a possibility. As she walked up the front path, she could feel his eyes on her back. When she reached the porch and turned around, he was still standing by the fence, his dark gaze unreadable. He raised his hand in a small wave, then led his horse down the street toward the boarding house where Mrs. Kowalski rented rooms by the week. That night at dinner, Pastor Henderson brought up the stranger without prompting. "I've been asking around about that Morrison fellow," he said, cutting his pot roast with unnecessary force. "Nobody knows anything about him. That's not natural in a place like Texas. People talk. People remember." Maybe he kept to himself, Sarah May suggested, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to defend a man she barely knew. "A man who keeps to himself is a man with something to hide," Pastor Henderson replied. "I don't want you speaking to him again, Sarah May. There's something not right about him." Sarah May nodded obediently, but, privately, she disagreed. There might be something mysterious about Jake Morrison, but that didn't necessarily mean it was something bad. Maybe he was running from pain, not trouble. Maybe he'd lost someone, or made mistakes he was trying to leave behind. Maybe he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man looking for honest work and a fresh start. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed regularly. Redemption Valley was small enough that avoiding someone required considerable effort, and Sarah May found she didn't want to make that effort. Jake was unfailingly polite, always touching his hat and exchanging pleasantries, but never crossing the line into impropriety. He seemed to understand the delicate social dynamics of small-town life, where a single conversation could fuel gossip for months. Still, Sarah May began to notice things about him. The way he gentled his horse with quiet words and patient hands. How he always held doors for women and tipped his hat to elders. The fact that he attended church services, sitting in the back row with his hat in his hands and his attention focused on Pastor Henderson's sermons with an intensity that suggested genuine interest rather than social obligation. He worked hard at the Rocking M, according to Mrs. Martinez, who had taken to singing his praises to anyone who would listen. He was reliable, skilled, and respectful. He'd already repaired 2 sections of fence that had been problematic for months, and he'd somehow convinced her most stubborn mare to accept a saddle after weeks of failed attempts by other hands. But it was the small things that caught Sarah May's attention. The way he helped old Mr. Peterson load feed sacks into his truck without being asked. How he'd quietly paid for the widow Morrison's groceries when she'd come up short at the register. The fact that he'd spent his day off helping repair the church roof after a summer storm had torn off several shingles. These weren't the actions of a dangerous man, despite her father's continued suspicions. These were the actions of someone who understood responsibility, community, and kindness. Someone who might have made mistakes in the past but was working hard to make amends. The first real conversation they had beyond polite pleasantries happened on a sweltering Saturday in early August. Sarah May had been helping her father inventory feed supplies in the store's backroom when she heard raised voices from the front. She emerged to find Jake Morrison standing at the counter, his jaw tight with controlled anger, while Bud Harrington, the town drunk and general troublemaker, swayed on his feet and spewed insults. "We don't need your kind here, stranger," Bud was saying, his words slurred but his malice clear. "Town was peaceful before you showed up. Maybe it's time you moved on." Jake's hands were clenched at his sides, but his voice remained level. "I'm not looking for trouble, Bud. Just came in to buy some supplies." "Trouble's what follows men like you," Bud continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was the only one causing problems. "I can smell it on you. Same smell my daddy used to get before he'd disappear for weeks at a time." Pastor Henderson had stepped out for lunch, leaving Sarah May alone to handle the situation. She could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the way his jaw worked as he fought to maintain his composure. She could also see that Bud was working himself up to something more than just words. "Bud, you need to leave," Sarah May said firmly, stepping between the two men. "You're drunk, and you're being rude to a paying customer." "Sarah May, honey, you don't know what you're dealing with here," Bud said, his bloodshot eyes shifting to her with an expression she didn't like. "This here's a dangerous man. I can tell. Got the look of a killer about him." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah May felt Jake go very still behind her, and, for a moment, she wondered if Bud might be right. Then, Jake spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Bud take an involuntary step backward. "I think the lady asked you to leave," Jake said. "Might want to do as she says." There was something in his tone that suggested Bud would be wise to listen. The drunk apparently heard it too, because he mumbled something under his breath and stumbled toward the door, shooting a malevolent look over his shoulder before disappearing into the afternoon heat. Sarah May turned to face Jake, suddenly, aware that they were alone in the store for the first time since he'd arrived in town. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting into sun and wind. She could also see something else, something that looked like gratitude mixed with regret. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Sarah May replied. "Bud Harrington's been the town drunk for 20 years. He doesn't speak for anybody but himself." Jake studied her face for a long moment. "Your father wouldn't approve of you defending me." It wasn't a question, and Sarah May didn't pretend it was. "My father's a good man, but he sees danger where sometimes there's just difference." "And what do you see?" The question was asked quietly, but Sarah May sensed it mattered more than casual conversation. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands remained steady despite the confrontation he'd just endured, the patience in his dark eyes as he waited for her answer. "I see someone who's traveled a long way to find something," she said finally. "I'm just not sure what it is you're looking for." Jake's smile was small and sad. "Neither am I, Miss Henderson. Neither am I." The summer social at the Grange Hall was the biggest event in Redemption Valley's social calendar. Every year, families gathered to celebrate the harvest season with food, music, and dancing that would last well past midnight. Sarah May had attended every social since she was old enough to walk, but this year felt different. This year, she found herself spending an unusual amount of time deciding what to wear. She finally settled on a pale blue dress that brought out her eyes, with a modest neckline that would satisfy her father's standards while still managing to flatter her figure. She'd spent extra time arranging her auburn hair, letting loose curls frame her face instead of pulling it back in her usual practical style. The Grange Hall buzzed with activity when the Henderson family arrived. Long tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and roasted meats that represented the best efforts of every cook in the county. A makeshift bandstand had been erected at one end of the hall, where the Murphy brothers were tuning their fiddles while old Sam Garrett adjusted his guitar. Sarah May helped her mother arrange their contribution to the potluck, a green bean casserole that was famous throughout the valley, while scanning the crowd for a familiar silhouette. She told herself she was just curious whether Jake Morrison would attend, but her racing pulse suggested otherwise. Looking for someone specific? Her younger brother Tommy appeared at her elbow, grinning with the knowing expression that made her want to throttle him. At 19, Tommy had developed an annoying ability to read her moods and motivations. "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah May said, but her cheeks warmed anyway. "Right," Tommy drawled. "Just like you weren't staring out the store window every day last week, hoping to catch sight of that cowboy." Before Sarah May could formulate a suitable retort, the Murphy brothers struck up their first tune, a lively square dance that had couples hurrying to form sets on the makeshift dance floor. She watched the familiar ritual with pleasure, remembering childhood evenings when her father would swing her around the kitchen while her mother hummed along to whatever tune drifted from the radio. "Miss Henderson?" The voice came from directly behind her, and Sarah May turned to find Jake Morrison standing there with his hat in his hands. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, trading his work clothes for pressed jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a black vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair had been recently cut, and he'd shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw and a small scar near his left ear that she hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Morrison," she managed, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the way her heart had started its familiar wild rhythm. "I'm glad you decided to come." "Mrs. Martinez insisted," Jake said, his lips quirking in what might have been amusement. "Said it would be impolite to decline the invitation, especially since she'd volunteered to provide music accompaniment." Sarah May glanced toward the bandstand, where she could indeed see Mrs. Martinez settling behind the upright piano that had been wheeled in for the occasion. The older woman caught her eye and winked, making Sarah May suspect the ranch owner had ulterior motives for encouraging Jake's attendance. "She's a wise woman," Sarah May said. "These socials are important to the community. They help everyone stay connected." "Is that what they do?" Jake's dark eyes seemed to be studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "Or do they serve other purposes?" Before she could ask what he meant, the music shifted to a slower waltz. Couples began pairing off for the more formal dance, and Sarah May watched with a mixture of longing and resignation. She'd danced with local boys before, of course, but none of them had ever made her pulse race or her palms grow damp with nervousness. "Would you care to dance?" Jake's question was so quiet she almost missed it over the music. Sarah May's eyes widened in surprise. That is. She glanced around the hall, noting the way several conversations had paused as people noticed Jake's presence. Her father was deep in discussion with the bank president near the refreshment table, but she knew it would only be a matter of time before he realized what was happening. Just one dance, Jake said, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. I promised to maintain proper distance. The smart thing would be to decline. The safe thing would be to make some excuse about helping in the kitchen or checking on the younger children. But Sarah May found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. Jake's hand was warm and slightly calloused as he led her onto the dance floor. He placed his other hand on her waist with careful propriety, maintaining the traditional frame of a proper waltz. But even that innocent contact sent shivers through Sarah May's entire body. You're an excellent dancer, she observed as he led her smoothly through the first turn. His movements were confident but not showy, and he seemed to anticipate the music's rhythm perfectly. My mother insisted on lessons, Jake replied. Said a gentleman should be able to escort a lady properly on any occasion. It was the first personal detail he'd shared about his past, and Sarah May found herself hungry for more. She sounds like a wise woman. Jake's expression grew distant. She was. Died when I was 16. I'm sorry, Sarah May said softly, meaning it. She could hear the old pain in his voice, carefully controlled but still present. Long time ago, Jake said, but his hand tightened slightly on hers. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the measure of a person was how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them. Sarah May thought about his quiet acts of kindness around town, the way he'd helped people without expectation of recognition or reward. You learned her lessons well. I tried to, Jake said. Though I haven't always succeeded. There was something in his tone that suggested a story, probably a painful one. Sarah May wanted to ask, wanted to understand what had brought such shadows to his eyes, but the music was already winding down. Their dance would be over in moments, and she had no idea when she might get another chance to talk with him privately. Mr. Morrison, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. Jake, he corrected quietly. When we're like this, just Jake. The intimacy of using his first name sent another shiver through her. Jake, then. I wanted you to know that not everyone in town shares my father's suspicions. Some of us believe in giving a person a chance to prove themselves. Jake's dark eyes searched her face. And what if a person has things in his past that can't be proved or disproved? What if all he can offer is his word that he's trying to be better than he was? Then, his word is enough, Sarah May said without hesitation. For some people, anyway. The music ended, and Jake stepped back with obvious reluctance. Thank you for the dance, Miss Henderson. It was memorable. He was preparing to escort her back to the sidelines when Pastor Henderson appeared beside them, his pale eyes cold with displeasure. Sarah May, he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant trouble. I believe your mother needs assistance in the kitchen. It was clearly a dismissal, and an unmistakable warning. Sarah May felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, not for herself but for Jake, who was being treated like a pariah for no reason beyond being a stranger. Of course, Daddy, she said, but her eyes remained on Jake's face. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Morrison. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Jake nodded formally. Pastor Henderson, he said, acknowledging the older man with careful politeness. Miss Henderson. Thank you again. As Sarah May walked away, she could feel the weight of multiple gazes on her back. The dancing had paused momentarily while people processed what they'd witnessed, and she knew there would be talk. In a town like Redemption Valley, a single dance could fuel speculation for weeks. The kitchen was bustling with activity as the women prepared to serve dessert, and Sarah May threw herself into the work with forced enthusiasm. But her mind remained fixed on those few minutes in Jake's arms, the way he'd held her with such careful respect, the hints of vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. He's a fine dancer, Mrs. Martinez commented, appearing at Sarah May's elbow with a knowing smile. Polite, too. Asked my permission before requesting the dance. He did? Sarah May couldn't hide her surprise. Course he did. Man's got proper manners, unlike some folks in this town. Mrs. Martinez's tone suggested she had specific people in mind, and Sarah May suspected her father was among them. Been working for me 6 weeks now, and I can tell you he's got integrity. Does his job without complaint, helps out wherever he's needed, doesn't gossip or stir up trouble. But Sarah May sensed there was more. Mrs. Martinez was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. But he's got ghosts, that one. Something in his past that weighs on him. Don't know what it is, and don't plan to ask, but it's there. Question is whether those ghosts are dangerous to anyone but himself. It was an honest assessment, and Sarah May appreciated the older woman's candor. Mrs. Martinez had raised 5 sons and buried 2 husbands. She knew men and their complications better than most people. Do you think he's dangerous? Sarah May asked quietly. Not to anyone who doesn't mean him harm, Mrs. Martinez said firmly. But a man running from his past can't always control when that past catches up with him. That's something to keep in mind, Nija. The evening continued with more dancing, card games, and the usual social rituals that marked such gatherings. Sarah May participated with her usual enthusiasm, but part of her attention remained focused on Jake, who had retreated to the edges of the celebration. He was polite when approached, even joining a poker game with some of the ranch hands, but she could see the way he held himself apart, as if he didn't quite believe he belonged. Around 11 o'clock, she slipped outside for some fresh air. The August night was warm and heavy with the scent of honeysuckle from Mrs. Patterson's garden next door. Fireflies danced among the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Needed some quiet too? Sarah May turned to find Jake emerging from the shadows near the far end of the porch. He'd put his hat back on, and, in the dim light from the hall's windows, she could barely make out his features. It gets a bit overwhelming inside, she admitted. All that music and talking and laughing. Sometimes a person needs to remember what silence sounds like. Jake moved closer, but stopped at a careful distance. Your father wasn't pleased about the dance. It wasn't a question, and Sarah May didn't pretend otherwise. My father worries about me. Sometimes that worry makes him see threats where none exist. And sometimes threats are real, even when they're not intended, Jake said quietly. A man in my position has no business dancing with a preacher's daughter, regardless of his intentions. What position is that? Sarah May asked, moving closer despite every sensible instinct telling her to maintain distance. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and she could see the internal struggle in his face. A man with a past he's not proud of. A man who's made mistakes that can't be undone. What kind of mistakes? The kind that hurt innocent people, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The kind that follow a man no matter how far he runs or how hard he tries to make amends. Sarah May's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. We all make mistakes, Jake. The measure of a person isn't whether they've stumbled, but whether they get back up and try to do better. Some mistakes don't deserve forgiveness, Jake said. Some things a man does mark him permanently, no matter his intentions. Did you set out to hurt someone? Sarah May asked. Did you wake up one morning and decide to cause pain? No, Jake said quickly. No, it was never intentional. But intention doesn't always matter when the consequences are permanent. Sarah May studied his face in the dim light, seeing the self-condemnation that had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. Whatever he'd done, whatever had driven him to Redemption Valley, he was clearly punishing himself far more harshly than any court or community ever could. Maybe, she said carefully, the mistake you're making now is believing that past mistakes define your entire worth as a person. Jake's head came up sharply, and she could see surprise in his expression. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Sarah May stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. I see how you work at the ranch, how you help people around town without being asked, how you treat everyone with respect even when they don't return it. I see a man trying to build something good, and I think that matters more than whatever came before. Sarah May. Her name on his lips was part warning, part plea. "I know it's not my business," she continued, knowing she was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed but unable to stop herself. "I know my father would be horrified if he knew we were having this conversation. But I also know that good people sometimes make bad choices, and bad choices don't necessarily make someone a bad person." Jake stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war between hope and despair playing out in his dark eyes. "You're too generous," he said finally. "Too willing to see good where none exists. Or maybe you're too harsh. Too willing to condemn yourself beyond any reasonable judgment." The sound of laughter from inside the hall reminded them both that they were standing dangerously close on a public porch, having a conversation that would scandalize the entire town if it were overheard. Jake stepped back reluctantly, putting proper distance between them. "I should go," he said. "People will start to notice if we're both missing." "Probably," Sarah May agreed, but she made no move toward the door. "Sarah May," Jake's voice stopped her as she finally turned to go inside. "Thank you. For the dance, for believing there might be something worth saving." "There is," she said with quiet conviction. "I'm sure of it." Inside, the social was winding down. Families were beginning the ritual of gathering children, collecting empty dishes, and making plans for the following week. Sarah May helped clean up with her usual efficiency, but her mind remained fixed on those moments on the porch, on the pain in Jake's voice and the way her name had sounded when he spoke it. The ride home was quiet, with Tommy dozing against the wagon's side and Pastor Henderson focused on guiding their horse through the dark. But Sarah May could feel her father's disapproval like a weight in the summer air, and she knew their conversation about Jake Morrison was far from over. It came the next morning, as she was hanging laundry behind the house. Pastor Henderson emerged from his study with the grim expression that meant he'd been praying for guidance and hadn't liked the answers he'd received. "Sarah May, we need to talk." She continued hanging sheets, but her hands stilled as she waited for the lecture she knew was coming. "I saw you last night," Pastor Henderson said quietly. "Dancing with that Morrison fellow, and later on the porch. I also saw the way you looked at him." Sarah May's cheeks warmed, but she met her father's gaze steadily. "He's a kind man, Daddy. He works hard, he's respectful to everyone, and he's never done anything to earn your suspicion. A man doesn't ride into town with nothing but a horse and a saddlebag unless he's running from something," Pastor Henderson replied. "And a man who won't talk about his past is a man with something to hide." "Maybe he's running from pain, not trouble," Sarah May said, echoing her earlier thoughts. "Maybe his past is private, not dangerous." Pastor Henderson sighed heavily. "Sarah May, you're 24 years old. You're intelligent, capable, and strong in your faith. But you're also innocent in ways that could get you hurt. There are things in this world that you haven't seen, darkness that you haven't experienced, and I thank God for that every day." "I'm not a child, Daddy." "No," he agreed. "You're not. Which is why I'm going to speak to you plainly. That man is trouble. I don't know what kind of trouble, but I can feel it in my bones. And I won't stand by and watch him pull you into whatever web of complications he's carrying." Sarah May wanted to argue, wanted to defend Jake and her own judgment. But she could see the genuine fear in her father's eyes, the love that motivated his concerns, and she found she couldn't dismiss them entirely. "I understand your worries," she said carefully. "But I also think you might be wrong about him." "I hope I am," Pastor Henderson said quietly. "But until I know for certain, I want your word that you won't seek out his company. If you encounter him around town, be polite but distant. Don't encourage whatever feelings I saw in his eyes last night." It was a reasonable request from a concerned father, and Sarah May knew she should agree immediately. But the memory of Jake's careful courtesy, his gentle hands, and the vulnerability he'd revealed on the porch made compliance difficult. "Sarah May," Pastor Henderson's voice carried a note of warning. "I need your word." "You have it," she said finally, though the promise felt like a betrayal of something precious and fragile. 3 weeks passed in careful avoidance. Sarah May kept her word to her father, nodding politely when she encountered Jake around town but never lingering for conversation. She saw him at church, sitting in his usual back pew with his attention focused on Pastor Henderson's sermons. She glimpsed him loading supplies at the feed store, always courteous to other customers but never attempting to engage her in anything beyond the most basic pleasantries. But avoidance didn't mean she stopped noticing him. If anything, the forced distance made her more aware of his presence. She noticed the way he helped Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries when her arthritis was acting up. She heard about him staying late to help young Billy Crawford fix a broken bridle when the boy couldn't afford to pay the saddle maker. She observed the quiet way he'd slip Mrs. Kowalski extra money for his room when he thought no one was looking, knowing the widow was struggling to make ends meet. These weren't the actions of a dangerous man, despite her father's continued suspicions. These were the actions of someone who understood responsibility and kindness, someone who was working hard to build something positive in a new place. The complications began on a sweltering Thursday in late August. Sarah May was closing the store alone, her parents having left early for a church council meeting, when she heard shouting from the direction of Mama Rosie's diner. She stepped outside to see a crowd gathering, and her heart sank as she recognized one of the voices rising above the general commotion. Jake Morrison was in the middle of Main Street, facing off against three men she recognized as ranch hands from the Circle K spread. The largest of them, a man named Curtis Delroy, was known throughout the county for his quick temper and quicker fists. He'd been drinking, judging by the way he swayed on his feet, and his companions looked ready to back whatever play he decided to make. "Think you're better than us, stranger?" Curtis was saying, his words slurred but his intent clear. "Coming into our town, taking our jobs, sniffing around our women?" Jake stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides but his body coiled with potential energy. "I'm not looking for trouble, Curtis. Why don't you sleep it off and we'll forget this happened." "Sleep it off?" Curtis laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "You cost me a job at the Rocking M, stranger. Mrs. Martinez hired you instead of me, and I want to know why. What makes a drifter worth more than a man who's lived here his whole life?" Sarah May could see the crowd growing larger as people emerged from buildings and gathered to watch the confrontation. This was the kind of drama that Redemption Valley rarely saw, and everyone wanted to witness how it would unfold. "Mrs. Martinez makes her own hiring decisions," Jake replied calmly. "If you have a problem with them, you should take it up with her." "I'm taking it up with you," Curtis snarled, stepping closer. "Man to man. Unless you're too yellow to back up whatever lies you told to get that job." Jake's expression didn't change, but Sarah May caught the subtle shift in his stance. He was preparing for violence, even though he clearly didn't want it. "Curtis, this is foolish," Jake said quietly. "You're drunk, and you're upset about something that has nothing to do with me. Walk away now, and we'll both forget this happened." "The hell we will." Curtis lunged forward, throwing a wild punch that Jake avoided with minimal effort. What followed was less a fight than a demonstration. Curtis was bigger and probably stronger, but Jake moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd been trained to fight by experts. He deflected Curtis's attacks almost casually, never striking back but simply avoiding damage while his opponent wore himself out against empty air. The crowd watched in fascination as Curtis grew increasingly frustrated, his swings becoming wilder and more desperate. His two companions made half-hearted moves to join the fight, but something in Jake's eyes when he glanced at them made them reconsider. It ended when Curtis, red-faced and gasping, threw one final haymaker that left him completely off balance. Jake stepped aside, and Curtis stumbled past him into the watering trough outside the general store. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, but Jake didn't look triumphant. If anything, he looked tired and sad, as if the confrontation had reminded him of things he'd rather forget. "Show's over," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Curtis, you might want to get yourself some coffee and a ride home." He turned to leave, then stopped as his gaze found Sarah May standing on the store's front porch. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw something that made her heart ache. Not pride in his victory, but regret that violence had been necessary at all. Jake touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then walked away toward the boarding house. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with commentary about what they'd witnessed, but Sarah May remained frozen on the porch, processing what she'd seen. Jake Morrison wasn't just good with horses and ranch work. He was trained in combat, skilled in ways that suggested military service or worse. But, more importantly, he'd shown remarkable restraint. A man with truly violent tendencies would have hurt Curtis badly, possibly permanently. Instead, Jake had used just enough force to end the threat while preserving his opponent's dignity. That night, Sarah May lay awake thinking about the fight, about Jake's controlled movements and the sadness in his eyes afterward. She thought about her father's warnings and her own growing feelings for a man she barely knew. Most of all, she thought about the way Jake had looked at her, as if her opinion mattered more than the cheers and jeers of the crowd. The next evening brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah May was helping her mother prepare dinner when Mrs. Martinez knocked on the front door, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Evening, Pastor Henderson, Mrs. Henderson," she said formally. "I wonder if I might have a word about yesterday's unpleasantness." Pastor Henderson invited her in, and they settled in the front parlor while Sarah May served coffee and tried not to look too interested in the conversation. "I want to set the record straight about Jake Morrison," Mrs. Martinez began without preamble. "I know there's been talk since yesterday, speculation about his background and whether he might be dangerous." "The man's clearly had training," Pastor Henderson observed. "That wasn't luck or natural ability that let him handle Curtis so easily." "No, it wasn't," Mrs. Martinez agreed. "Jake served in the military, special forces. Did 3 tours in places most folks can't pronounce, saw things that would break a weaker man." Sarah May felt her breath catch. Military service would explain Jake's discipline, his skills, and possibly the ghosts Mrs. Martinez had mentioned. It would also explain his reluctance to discuss his past. "What else do you know about him?" Pastor Henderson asked. Mrs. Martinez was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words. "I know he was married. Lost his wife and daughter in a car accident while he was overseas. Came home to bury them both, and something in him broke." The coffee cup slipped from Sarah May's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. She knelt quickly to clean up the mess, but her hands were shaking too badly to be effective. "Sarah May, let me help with that," her mother said gently, but Sarah May barely heard her. Her mind was reeling with the implications of Mrs. Martinez's revelation. Jake had been married. Had lost a family in the most tragic way possible. No wonder he carried such shadows in his eyes, such carefully controlled pain. No wonder he'd said some mistakes couldn't be forgiven. He was probably blaming himself for not being there when they needed him. "That explains a great deal," Pastor Henderson said quietly. "The man's carrying survivor's guilt." Among other things, Mrs. Martinez confirmed. After the funeral, he started drinking, getting into fights, couldn't hold a job. Eventually got arrested for assault after beating a man half to death in a bar fight. Spent 6 months in jail, and, when he got out, he decided he needed to get as far from his old life as possible. Sarah May's heart clenched with sympathy and understanding. Jake wasn't running from something evil he'd done, he was running from grief so overwhelming it had nearly destroyed him. The careful control she'd observed, the restraint he'd shown with Curtis, all of it made sense now. He was a man fighting every day not to become the person his pain wanted him to be. "The assault charge," Pastor Henderson said carefully. "How serious was it?" "Serious enough," Mrs. Martinez admitted. But the other man had been taunting Jake about his family, making jokes about dead soldiers and their dead wives. Jake snapped, and, honestly, most folks thought the other man got what was coming to him. Jake pled guilty, did his time, and hasn't touched alcohol since. "Why are you telling us this?" Pastor Henderson asked. Mrs. Martinez glanced at Sarah May, who was still kneeling by the broken china, though she'd stopped pretending to clean it up. "Because I've watched that man work for me every day for 2 months, and I've seen how he conducts himself. He's not the same person who threw those punches in that bar. He's worked hard to become better, to find some kind of peace with what happened to him." "But?" Pastor Henderson's tone suggested he sensed there was more. "But healing takes time, and some wounds never fully close," Mrs. Martinez said sadly. Jake's a good man trying to build a good life, but his past isn't completely buried. There are still nights when the nightmares wake him, still days when the grief threatens to pull him under. He's functional, but he's fragile in ways that might not be obvious. After Mrs. Martinez left, the Henderson family sat in uncomfortable silence. Sarah May continued to process what she'd learned, trying to reconcile the gentle, controlled man she'd come to know with the broken, violent person described in the story. "It changes things," Pastor Henderson said finally. "Does it?" Sarah May asked, surprising herself with the question. Her father looked at her sharply. "A man with his history, his problems, yes, it changes things. The violence, the drinking, the inability to cope with loss, those are serious issues. But he's overcome them," Sarah May pointed out. "Mrs. Martinez said he doesn't drink anymore, and we saw yesterday that he has perfect control over his temper. If anything, knowing his story makes his current behavior more admirable, not less." Sarah May, her mother said gently. "The man lost his family. That kind of trauma leaves permanent marks. Even if he's managed to control his worst impulses, he'll always carry that pain. And he'll always be comparing any new relationship to what he lost," Pastor Henderson added. "A woman would be competing with ghosts, trying to heal wounds that might be too deep to ever fully mend." Sarah May wanted to argue, wanted to point out that everyone carried pain of one kind or another, that Jake's honesty about his struggles was preferable to the hidden damages that might lurk in seemingly perfect people. But she could see the concern in her parents' faces, the love that motivated their warnings, and she found herself nodding reluctantly. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's good to know the truth, even if it's complicated." But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind rattle the shutters, Sarah May couldn't stop thinking about Jake Morrison. Not the violent, broken man from the story, but the gentle person who helped neighbors without being asked, who showed kindness to children and respect to elders, who carried his pain with such dignity that most people never suspected its depth. She thought about the loneliness that must consume him, the way he held himself apart not from arrogance but from fear of causing more damage. She thought about his careful courtesy, his reluctance to presume friendship or acceptance, the way he'd looked at her on the porch that night as if she were something precious and impossible. Most of all, she thought about the words he'd whispered on the porch, "Some things a man does mark him permanently." Now she understood what he'd meant. He wasn't just carrying guilt about past mistakes, he was carrying the weight of unimaginable loss, the kind of grief that changed a person's fundamental relationship with the world. The decision came to her slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. She couldn't make Jake's pain disappear, couldn't bring back his lost family or erase the guilt that haunted him. But she could offer friendship, understanding, perhaps even love to a man who clearly believed he deserved none of those things. The opportunity came 3 days later. Sarah May was walking home from the store when a sudden thunderstorm broke over the valley, sending sheets of rain across the dusty streets. She took shelter in the doorway of Mama Rosie's diner, watching the lightning dance across the sky and hoping the storm would pass quickly. Nasty weather. She turned to find Jake emerging from the diner's interior, a cup of coffee in his hands and that familiar careful expression on his face. They were alone in the small alcove, protected from the rain but visible to anyone who might look out the diner's windows. "I love storms," Sarah May said impulsively. "They remind me that nature is bigger and more powerful than all our small human concerns." Jake studied her face with interest. "Most people find them frightening." "Some things are worth being a little frightened of," Sarah May replied, meeting his gaze directly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain turn the street into a temporary river. Sarah May was acutely aware of Jake's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body and the subtle tension that always seemed to surround him. "Sarah May," he said quietly, using her first name for the second time since they'd met. "I want you to know that I heard about the conversation with Mrs. Martinez." Sarah May's cheeks warmed. "I figured word would get around." "It usually does in a place like this," Jake agreed. "I also figure it probably changed how you see me." "It did," Sarah May said honestly. "But maybe not in the way you think." Jake's dark eyes searched her face. "What do you mean?" Sarah May took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I mean that knowing your story doesn't make me think less of you. If anything, it makes me admire the man you've become even more. Jake went very still. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Sarah May turned to face him fully, ignoring the risk of being seen through the diner's windows. I know you've suffered losses most people can't imagine. I know you've made mistakes while trying to cope with that suffering. And I know you've worked incredibly hard to become better than your worst moments. Sarah May. Her name was a warning, but she could hear something else beneath it. Hope, maybe, or desperate longing. I also know that you're alone, she continued, her voice soft but determined. That you hold yourself apart because you think your pain might contaminate other people. But isolation isn't healing, Jake. Sometimes connection is the only thing that can help a person find their way back to themselves. The storm was moving away, the thunder growing distant, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were standing close enough that Sarah May could see the rain droplets clinging to Jake's dark hair, close enough to feel the rise and fall of his chest as his breathing quickened. You deserve better, Jake said quietly. You deserve someone whole, someone who can give you his complete heart without shadows or complications. What if I don't want someone whole? Sarah May asked. What if I want someone real, someone who understands that life can be painful and beautiful and complicated all at the same time? Jake's control was clearly slipping. She could see it in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, in the muscle that jumped in his jaw as he fought some internal battle. Your father would kill me if he knew we were having this conversation, he said finally. My father isn't here, Sarah May pointed out. And I'm a grown woman capable of making my own decisions about who I want to know, and how well I want to know them. The rain had stopped, but Jake made no move to leave the shelter of the doorway. Instead, he studied Sarah May's face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and cherished at the same time. If we were to. He stopped, shaking his head. I can't offer you what other men could. I can't promise you uncomplicated happiness or a future free from my ghosts. I'm not asking for promises, Sarah May said softly. I'm asking for honesty. For the chance to know you as you really are, not as the town thinks you are or as you think you should be. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah May could practically feel the war being waged in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear him. There's a place, he said. About 2 miles north of town, where the creek bends around those big cottonwoods. Do you know it? Sarah May nodded. It was a spot she'd visited as a child, a peaceful grove where the water ran clear and the trees provided shelter from the summer heat. If you wanted to. Jake's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. When? Sarah May asked, her heart racing. Tonight, Jake said. After the church social ends and people are settled in for the evening. If you're certain you want to take this risk. Sarah May thought about her father's warnings, about the practical considerations and social complications such a meeting would create if it were discovered. Then, she thought about Jake's lonely eyes and careful courtesy, about the way he'd looked at her as if she were something precious and impossible. I'll be there, she said quietly. Jake nodded once, then stepped out into the damp evening air. Sarah May, he called back, and she could hear something almost like wonder in his voice. Thank you. For believing there might be something worth saving. As she watched him walk away, Sarah May felt a mixture of anticipation and terror unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Tonight would change everything, she realized. Whatever happened in that grove by the creek, there would be no going back to polite distance and careful avoidance. Tonight, she was going to discover what it meant to risk everything for the possibility of love. Sarah May had never been so aware of time's passage. Every minute of the church social dragged by with agonizing slowness, each conversation requiring tremendous effort to maintain focus. She helped serve refreshments, participated in the traditional hymn singing, and smiled at all the appropriate moments, but her mind remained fixed on the approaching rendezvous. By 10 o'clock, families were beginning their usual ritual of gathering children and preparing for departure. Sarah May assisted with cleanup, her movements automatic while her pulse thundered in her ears. She'd managed to slip away from similar gatherings before, usually to enjoy solitude in her mother's garden or to read by lamplight in her room. But tonight's escape would be different. Tonight, she was walking deliberately towards something that could change her life forever. "You're quiet this evening," her mother observed as they loaded the last of the church dishes into their wagon. "Just tired," Sarah May replied, hoping her voice sounded normal. "It's been a long day at the store." Mrs. Henderson studied her daughter's face with the intuitive perception that mothers possess. "You're not coming down with something, are you? You look flushed." "I'm fine, Mama. Just ready to get home and rest." The ride back to the Henderson property passed in relative silence, with Tommy dozing against the wagon side and Pastor Henderson focused on navigating the dark road. Sarah May forced herself to breathe steadily, to project an aura of calm normalcy while her heart raced with anticipation and terror. At home, she went through her usual evening routine with careful precision. She helped her mother clean the kitchen, listened to her father read from scripture, and kissed both parents goodnight with the same affection she'd shown every evening for 24 years. Only when she heard the familiar sounds of the household settling into sleep did she allow herself to consider what came next. She'd already chosen her clothing earlier, selecting a simple blue dress that could be donned quickly and quietly. Her hair she left loose, falling in auburn waves past her shoulders in a style far less proper than her usual careful arrangements. If she was going to take this risk, she decided, she would take it as herself, not as the perfectly controlled preacher's daughter everyone expected her to be. The walk to the cottonwood grove took longer than anticipated. Sarah May had forgotten how different the countryside looked in darkness, how shadows could transform familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes that required careful navigation. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to avoid major obstacles, but she still found herself proceeding with caution through terrain she could have traversed blindfolded in daylight. The sound of running water reached her before she saw the creek. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their massive trunks creating pools of deeper shadow beneath the spreading canopy. Sarah May paused at the edge of the grove, suddenly uncertain. What if Jake had changed his mind? What if this was a mistake that would hurt them both? "I wasn't sure you'd come." His voice emerged from the darkness near the water's edge, quiet and slightly wondering. Sarah May followed the sound, her eyes gradually adjusting to find Jake's silhouette against the pale gleam of the creek. He'd removed his hat, and moonlight caught the dark waves of his hair as he turned toward her. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted honestly. "Right up until the moment I started walking, I thought I might lose my courage." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see his face clearly. "You still can. There's no shame in changing your mind, in deciding this is too much risk for too little certainty." "Is that what you want?" Sarah May asked. "For me to change my mind?" Jake's silence stretched long enough that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made her chest ache with sympathy. "I want things I have no right to want," he said quietly. "Things that could hurt you in ways you haven't even considered. But, no, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay more than I've wanted anything in years, and that terrifies me more than you can imagine." Sarah May moved closer, drawn by the honest pain in his voice. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because wanting something means you can lose it," Jake replied simply. "And I've lost enough for one lifetime." "Or," Sarah May said gently, "wanting something means you might find it. That despite all the pain and loss, there might still be good things possible." Jake studied her face in the moonlight, and she could see the hope warring with fear in his dark eyes. "You're very young," he said finally. "I'm 24, Jake. Old enough to know my own mind." "Age isn't always about years," Jake observed. "It's about experiences, about the things life has taught you. You've been protected, sheltered. You've never had to rebuild yourself from nothing after everything you cared about was destroyed." "You're right," Sarah May acknowledged. "I haven't experienced that kind of loss. But I've watched my father counsel people through the worst moments of their lives. I've seen grief and trauma and recovery, and I've learned that surviving those things doesn't disqualify someone from deserving love." Jake's breath caught audibly. "Sarah May. What? She asked, stepping close enough to touch him if she chose. What are you so afraid of? I'm afraid that if I let myself care about you, really care about you, something will happen to take you away, Jake said, the words emerging like a confession torn from somewhere deep inside. I'm afraid that I'm fundamentally cursed, that everyone I love ends up paying the price for my mistakes. Sarah May felt tears prick her eyes at the raw anguish in his voice. That's not how love works, Jake. Bad things happen to people whether they're loved or not. Love doesn't cause tragedy any more than avoiding love prevents it. Doesn't it? Jake's laugh was bitter. I loved my wife and daughter with everything I had, and they died while I was half a world away playing soldier. If I'd been home, if I'd chosen differently. They might have died anyway, Sarah May said firmly. Car accidents happen to families with fathers present and fathers absent. Tragedy isn't a punishment for loving too much or not enough. Jake shook his head, but she could see the longing in his expression, the desperate want to believe her words. You don't understand, he said. The weight of carrying someone else's happiness, someone else's safety, knowing that your choices affect their entire life, I don't know if I'm strong enough to bear that responsibility again. What if you didn't have to bear it alone? Sarah May asked. What if love was about sharing burdens instead of carrying them in isolation? Before Jake could respond, she closed the remaining distance between them and placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel the rapid rhythm beneath her palm, the warmth of his body through the thin cotton shirt. Sarah May, he said, her name a warning and a plea. I know this is complicated, she said softly. I know there are no guarantees, no promises of easy happiness. But I also know that connection, real connection, is worth the risk. Jake's hand came up to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his chest. If we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back. Your reputation, your standing in the community, everything could change. Then, we'll face those changes together, Sarah May said with more confidence than she felt. Jake stared down at her for a long moment, and she could practically feel the internal battle raging in his mind. Finally, slowly, he lifted his free hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with achingly gentle reverence. You're certain? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm certain, Sarah May replied, though her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. Jake leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When their lips finally met, it was with a tenderness that took her breath away. The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he pressed too hard or moved too quickly. Sarah May had been kissed before, awkward stolen moments with boys from church or school. But this was different, deeper, charged with an emotion that made her entire body feel alive in ways she'd never experienced. When Jake finally pulled back, she found herself swaying toward him, seeking more contact. Don't stop, she whispered, the words emerging without conscious thought. Jake's control visibly cracked. His arms came around her fully, pulling her against him as he claimed her mouth with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. Sarah May melted into his embrace, her hands fisting in his shirt as she tried to get closer, to bridge whatever distance remained between them. They sank to the soft grass beside the creek, the sound of running water providing a natural symphony for their whispered endearments and gentle explorations. Jake's hands remained respectfully positioned even as his kisses grew more desperate, and Sarah May found herself touched by his continued restraint even in the midst of obvious desire. I've wanted to hold you since the first day I saw you, he murmured against her ear, his breath sending shivers through her entire body. Wanted to know if you were real or just something my lonely imagination conjured. I'm real, Sarah May assured him, pressing closer. We're both real, and this is real, and it's right, Jake. I can feel it. They lay entwined in the grass, talking quietly about dreams and fears, about Jake's memories of his lost family and Sarah May's hopes for her future. The moon tracked slowly across the sky as they discovered each other through conversation and gentle touches, building an intimacy that transcended the physical. Tell me about her, Sarah May said softly. Your wife. Jake was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Her name was Caroline. We met in high school, married right after graduation. She was everything good in the world. kind, patient, funny. She could find something to laugh about in the worst situations. And, your daughter? Jake's arms tightened around Sarah May. Emma. She was 3 when I left for my last deployment. Had Caroline's laugh and her mother's stubborn streak. She used to tell everyone that her daddy was a soldier who fought dragons. Sarah May felt tears slip down her cheeks at the love and loss in his voice. They sound wonderful. They were, Jake said simply. And they deserved better than a man who chose duty over family. You were serving your country, Sarah May protested. That's honorable, not selfish. Honor doesn't bring back the dead, Jake replied bitterly. Honor doesn't explain to a 3-year-old why daddy isn't there to read bedtime stories or check for monsters under the bed. Sarah May turned in his arms, facing him directly. Jake Morrison, you listen to me. You were doing what you thought was right, what you'd been trained to do. You can't blame yourself for a tragic accident that happened thousands of miles away. Can't I? Jake's smile was sad and self-deprecating. I've gotten pretty good at it over the past few years. Well, stop, Sarah May said firmly. It's not helping anyone, least of all their memory. Jake studied her face in the dim light, his expression shifting from pain to something that might have been wonder. How do you do that? Do what? Make everything seem possible again, even when logic says otherwise. Sarah May smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. Maybe that's my gift. Maybe I was put in your path to remind you that healing is possible, that love doesn't always end in loss. And, maybe, Jake said, pulling her closer, you were put in my path to remind me that some risks are worth taking, even when the stakes are terrifying. They made love slowly, carefully, with a tenderness that spoke of deep emotion rather than simple desire. Jake was infinitely patient, ensuring her comfort and pleasure with a consideration that moved Sarah May to tears. When she whispered "Don't stop" against his ear, it was a plea born of love rather than passion, a desperate need to hold on to this moment of perfect connection. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars wheel overhead while the creek murmured its ancient song. Sarah May felt fundamentally changed, not just by the physical intimacy but by the emotional vulnerability they'd shared. She understood now why people wrote poems about love, why they risked everything for moments like these. What happens now? She asked quietly as dawn approached. Jake was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted. This changes everything, and nothing. Your father still won't approve. The town still sees me as a dangerous stranger. We'll still have to be careful. But we'll have this, Sarah May said, pressing closer. We'll have each other. Yes, Jake agreed, his voice rough with emotion. We'll have each other. As they prepared to leave the grove, both knowing they needed to return before their absence was discovered, Jake caught Sarah May's hand. Sarah May, he said seriously. What we've shared tonight, what we've started, it's not a game or a temporary diversion. If we continue down this path, there will be consequences. For both of us. I know, Sarah May replied steadily. And I'm willing to face them. Are you? Jake studied her face for a long moment, then smiled with the first genuine joy she'd seen from him. Yeah, he said softly. I think I am. But, as they walked back toward town through the pre-dawn darkness, neither of them could have predicted the storm that was already building on the horizon. Love had given them hope and happiness, but it had also made them visible in ways that would soon attract dangerous attention. The past that Jake had tried so hard to outrun was about to catch up with him, and, when it did, both he and Sarah May would learn that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried, and some enemies too determined to simply forget and forgive. In Redemption Valley, the wind was already beginning to shift, carrying with it the scent of approaching trouble that would test their newfound love in ways neither could imagine. 3 weeks of stolen moments followed that night by the creek. 3 weeks of secret meetings and careful glances across crowded rooms. 3 weeks during which Sarah May discovered that love could make even the most mundane tasks feel charged with possibility, while also creating an undercurrent of constant tension that left her both exhilarated and exhausted. They were careful, perhaps too careful. Meeting only in places where discovery seemed impossible, maintaining their public facade of polite distance while privately growing closer with each whispered conversation. Jake would find reasons to visit the general store when Pastor Henderson was away, lingering just long enough to arrange their next rendezvous. Sarah May learned to read the subtle signals in his dark eyes, the slight tilt of his head that meant he would be waiting in the cottonwood grove after sunset. But secrets in small towns have a way of revealing themselves, and love, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves traces that observant eyes can detect. Mrs. Kowalski noticed that Jake had taken to disappearing from his boarding house room for hours at a time. Tommy Henderson observed that his sister had developed an unusual interest in evening walks, often returning with grass stains on her skirts and a dreamy expression that had nothing to do with appreciating nature. Most importantly, Pastor Henderson began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in his daughter's behavior. She was distracted during family prayers, distant during conversations, and prone to staring out windows with a look he'd never seen before. When pressed about her unusual moods, Sarah May offered explanations that were technically truthful but somehow felt incomplete. The crisis began on a Thursday morning in late September, when two strangers rode into Redemption Valley on horseback. Unlike Jake's solitary arrival months earlier, these men traveled together and carried themselves with the predatory alertness of professional trackers. They dismounted outside Mama Rosie's diner and proceeded to ask questions about recent arrivals to the area, specifically about a man matching Jake Morrison's description. Word of their inquiry reached Mrs. Martinez by noon, and she wasted no time.